I almost hate to say it, at this anxious and fractious time, when walls are being constructed daily, hourly, and it would seem unfashionable, perhaps even complacent, to look back and congratulate ourselves as a nation. But we have witnessed remarkable racial progress over the past 5 decades. What seemed fanciful, even utopian, 2 generations ago, is now so commonplace as to not bear any comment at all. We have come to expect and accept black and white in the workplace, on the playing field, in politics, in the military. And yet, you could feel it coming, couldn't you? That and yet. And yet our restaurants in America, like our neighborhoods, where we live and where we eat, in other words, where our interaction with one another is intimate, do not look much different today than they did 50 years ago. Dining out in this country has become markedly more egalitarian, it's true. And yet our restaurants remain deeply unintegrated places. That kingly vision of sitting down at the same table together and breaking bread is as smudgy as it's ever been. This is not a topic most people want to engage with, especially not in the food world, which is so often given to stories of celebration, uplift, and affirmation, and is so much more interested in ratifying its audience's taste and assumptions than in exploring difficult, complex truths. I spent nearly 10 years trying to interest editors in a piece on the subject of race in restaurants. As time and again, I ran up against the casual, liberal racism that is built into our American media. How? I was a white writer proposing to write about a black problem, as if race is the exclusive province of black Americans, as if we as whites should recuse ourselves from engaging with the great and unfortunately enduring subject of American life, the original sin of the Republic, which to this very day defines and determines our destinies, though you sure as hell wouldn't know it to read most American media accounts of race. One editor told me the story I proposed to write was dynamite, and he didn't mean in the Jimmy J.J. Walker sense. Note to all my millennial friends in the house, there used to be this thing called sitcoms, okay, which were these like really, really long GIFs with sound. Another editor told me that I had to find a black voice, or voices preferably, to tell this story. Well, I'm stubborn. I don't like being told no, or keep out, or this isn't for you. And so I began counting. Yes, I count faces. Something I began doing as a professor at Howard University, when I was made to see myself as white in the world. Whiteness not as neutral, as baseline, but as an idea, a construct. In writing a column about food and culture for the past 15 years, I ate out on average 10 times a week in restaurants that span the gamut from ambitious fine dining to so-called ethnic mom and pops. For 4 months, or 160 meals, I kept a tally of the non-whites in the room. Only 8 times out of 160 did I see more than 10 black folks in the room in a DC restaurant during any one lunch or dinner. On more than 90 of those restaurant visits, I did not see any faces other than white faces. And so I began asking questions, little by little, and over a period of years, talking casually with restaurateurs, chefs, and GMs in and around Washington, D.C. Nearly everyone I spoke with, black and white alike, requested that these conversations be off the record, which was interesting, I thought. Agreement, commonality, black and white in accord. But I soon realized that what accounted for this common ground of feeling was fear. From white restaurateurs, I learned of the existence of something I'd never heard of, an unspoken 60-40 line. 60-40. That's a dining room that's 60% white and 40% black. 40% is a tipping point, they said. more than 40% black, and suddenly, they said, the numbers don't just flip. More than 40%, and one told me, the whites scurried to their holes like mice. Soon, he said, you're looking at a restaurant where the clientele is predominantly black. I thought of the way we talk so much in this country about comfort food, as if food were a warm blanket on a cold, rainy night. A warm blanket to soothe us, and behind which we can also take cover. A couple years ago, the county executive in Prince George's County, where I live, a county that is more than 80% African American, asked my advice on a development project. I suggested pursuing a name chef for a fish and seafood restaurant, thinking the theme held broad appeal and would attract both upwardly mobile whites and blacks and draw from beyond the county. The CE's assistant I was having dinner with nodded. She liked the idea. But when I talked about a raw bar and such preparations as crudo, she stopped me. Raw fish? Not going to work. I can't sell a place like that to people in this county. She suggested an upscale soul food place with food, she said, like the Neelys make. It was a theme I heard again and again as black chefs and GMs tried to explain that there were entrenched differences formed and hardened over centuries of separation, and that accounted for this enduring black-white divide. That older, more economically stable black folks tended to dine early, not late. That important occasions in families are marked not by restaurant celebrations, but by home celebrations. Many black chefs I spoke to told me that as kids, they went out to eat maybe 3 times a year, if that. That for reasons going back centuries, many blacks haven't been exposed to the foods and cuisines that many whites take for granted. That the lack of black restaurateurs and of blacks in leading prominent positions in restaurants creates an impression that dining out is something for them and not for us. A woman who has spent more than a quarter century as both a cook and a consultant in DC told me, you take a fish place or a barbecue place and you're going to see black folks, guaranteed. These are the foods we know. These are our comfort foods. Now, you take unusual foods and in a setting that doesn't feel familiar and with lots of white folks in the room, Remember, why do we gather to eat? For most of us, black and white, it's to feel good, to feel a sense of well-being, of home. This idea of restaurants as dispensers, not of food and drink, but rather of the elusive abstraction of comfort, or as the case may be, discomfort, made me think of this man, Thomas Schelling, who, by the way, you're never going to find on the cover of Food and Wine. Schelling won a Nobel Prize in economics for his work in game theory, and in the early 70s devised what he called the Schelling segregation model, or tipping model. What Schelling was trying to do was to show how segregation in neighborhoods is not a result necessarily of virulent racism. He created a board game with pennies and dimes that he moved around according to various rules he established. The board was a city, and each square represented a house or lot. The pennies and dimes, agents, if you will, represented two groups in a society. I won't bore you with too many details, or I won't expose my appallingly limited knowledge of econ for you. But among the various rules he established for this game were what he called happiness rules. Under such happiness rules, if a penny or dime was unhappy, it would try to move to another location on the board, or possibly just exit the board entirely. If the agent's happiness rules expressed a strong preference for segregation, well, then the board quickly became segregated. But here's Schelling's revelation. Initially integrated boards tipped into full segregation even if the agent's happiness rules expressed only a mild preference for having neighbors of their own type. The implications of Schelling's study is that segregation is not necessarily organized or the result of profound racism. It can result from mild preferences on the part of just some in the group to associate with those from a similar background. So if you want heterogeneity or diversity, in other words, you need to intervene from the start, which is precisely what a DC restaurateur named Andy Shalal did. When he opened his first Busboys and Poets in the heart of DC's U Street corridor, he did not do so with the usual aims of a restaurateur. The neighborhood, the one-time Black Broadway, had thrived during Jim Crow, was gutted in the '68 riots, and has in the past decade become a seat of gentrification. Shalal, an Iraqi immigrant, was intent on social engineering and outcome. He practiced an unusual form of racial coding. Every detail on the table, on the menu, and in the room was chosen with an eye toward attracting and keeping a racial balance that he thought reflected the city. There were no field green salads, though field greens is exactly what they were. Chorizo went on the flatbreads, but Shalal called it pepperoni. There were quotes from Langston Hughes and images of MLK on the walls. At the same time, Shalal used music and event programming to ensure that the racial mix never tipped too far in one direction or the other. Some of my friends who are Black saw pandering and condescension, but many more embraced Shalal's unapologetically interventionist vision. He had not just opened his doors to the neighborhood. He had not just left things to chance. He had actively courted a class of diners ignored elsewhere. He had social engineered an outcome. I've been invited to speak many times about my research. And every time I stepped off the dais with a feeling that my work had only just begun, that this research was just the first step in my involvement. Well, the times, the perilous, Trumpy times, have pushed me. And I've begun taking an activist role in Richmond, Virginia, using my expertise to try to bridge divides between Black and white through food, to make food play the role it can, that of the uniter, of barrier smudger. This is North 23rd Street in Richmond, Union Hill. The Red Townhouse, that's a great little German-American restaurant named Metzger, nominated this year for a Beard Award. Opposite, Cedar Street Baptist Church, one of the largest Black churches in the city, with a congregation of 1,550 parishioners. Nobody from Metzger goes to the church. Nobody from the church goes to Metzger. 30 feet separates them. It might as well be 30 miles. In that sense, this corner in Richmond might be a corner in Baltimore, or St. Louis, or Dallas, or anywhere in America where gentrification is ringing its painful changes. Building on the work of Schelling and Shalal, I'm staging an intervention of my own. I hope not too late. Town halls and talks, diplomacy large and small, bridge dinners in which I'm working with the Metzger chef to use her building blocks, sausages, potatoes, dumplings, to find the seam between her German cuisine and the Southern and soul food cooking that her neighbors at the church and the surrounding neighborhood grew up on. A family meal initiative in which the restaurant will open at lunch 3 days a week to serve, for a very modest price, the kind of simple one-pot cooking that staffers eat before service, family meal. Will it succeed? I'm hopeful. It's going to take a mountain of work and sustained work over a long period of time. There is nothing organic or natural about this effort, but maybe, just maybe, out of the initial weeks and months of discomfort will come comfort, genuine, lasting comfort, that leads possibly to connection and even collaboration, and from there, ultimately, hopefully, to an understanding of our common cause. Thank you.